Hello, Milwaukee. Oh, it's good to be back in the Midwest. How's everybody doing today? You look great. And it's a balmy 25 degrees. The last time I was here was for, I'm sorry, what? Oh, you were just saying my name. Okay, I thought somebody got sick or something. And if you have a seat, go ahead and sit down. I'm going to be here for a while. The last time I was here was for Labor Fest a couple years back. Next time I think I should come for Summerfest. I hear it's pretty fun. It's okay. There's some people I want to acknowledge who are here today. First of all, your outstanding mayor, Tom Barrett, is here. County Executive Chris Abeley's here. Your Congresswoman Gwen Moore is in the house. Thank you to everyone at the United Community Center for hosting us here today. And as a special treat, your own Milwaukee Bucks are in the house. These are some fine young men, and I told them that as long as they weren't playing the Bulls, I'd root for them. But I want to say how much I appreciate Brent for sharing his story. Please give him a big round of applause. You know, when I received his letter, it made a powerful impact for me because it was so honest about the fact that he wasn't a supporter of mine, which is okay. I just bought him lunch, and I think maybe, of course, I'm term limited, so there's not much I can do now to get a vote, but we hugged it out. But for him to be able to express not what only he's going through personally, but also reflect on what that means for the rest of the country and the rest of Wisconsin, is extraordinary. We agree, Brent and I, that the Affordable Care Act is helping a whole lot of people like him. Brent is why we fought so hard to fix a broken health care system in the first place. It wasn't about Democrats or Republicans. It was about our values as Americans and making sure that hardworking Americans like Brent are no longer locked out of health insurance through no fault of their own. It was about the basic idea that in America, health care is not a privilege reserved for the few, but should be a right for all people. In the 6 years since I signed the Affordable Care Act into law, millions of people have bought affordable health insurance, and many of those bought it for the first time. Last summer, we learned that for the first time ever, America's uninsured rate has fallen below 10%. So this is the lowest rate of uninsured that we've seen since we started keeping these records. But we know that there are millions more who are eligible for coverage but haven't gotten it yet. And that's understandable. When you're going about your day-to-day life, going to work, taking care of your kids, you're not paying attention to enrollment deadlines. A lot of people still don't know that most consumers can get covered for less than $100 a month, less than your cell phone bill or your cable bill. And obviously there's been a lot of political noise surrounding the Affordable Care Act, so people haven't always known what's true and what's not. So here's what we did. We started a competition between 20 communities across America, from Philadelphia to Long Beach, from Atlanta to Denver, to see which city could get more of its uninsured neighbors to get covered. And I have to say that the folks who worked on this came up with some pretty clever ways to sign people up. In Seattle, folks held healthcare happy hours. Now that's a pretty good trick right there. In Nashville, they focused on music festivals. New Orleans created a challenge between barbershops and beauty salons. Oakland set up a healthcare storefront at City Hall for folks to visit and shop in. I'm pretty proud of my own hometown. Chicago outperformed every other competitor except one. Except one. Milwaukee came out on top. You get bragging rights this year. Bigger cities may have gotten more folks covered overall, but proportionally, relative to your size, you won out. All told, counting new folks and people renewing their coverage, you got nearly 90,000 people to sign up. That's enough to fill Lambeau Field, still have a big tailgating party with a lot of folks outside. And those tailgaters wouldn't have to worry because Obamacare covers indigestion from too many brats. They'd be covered. Okay. So this city should be proud. You did the best job of looking out for each other and taking care of each other. And I'm here to say congratulations. And what's remarkable is you did it by working together. Elected officials, hospitals, clinics, insurers, faith leaders, community leaders, businesses, nonprofits, everybody stepped up as a team. And you guys tried everything. Mayor Barrett was out there handing flyers out himself, stuck flyers to people's water bills, opened up libraries for enrollment events, set up a partnership with Uber to give folks a ride, covered buses and signs reminding people to sign up. Free clinics and health centers helped low-income residents enroll. Independent insurance agents even volunteered their time to help people choose the best option for them and their families. And some folks were skeptical that insurance was just too expensive. So healthcare navigators used a cost calculator to help people figure out the most affordable plans. You worked with TV stations to set up phone banks where viewers could call in and volunteers would help them sign up for coverage. It turns out they got a lot of calls from moms who wanted to sign up their young adult sons, which all of y'all, listen to your mom. She knows what's going on. And let's face it, men are just stupid sometimes. Don't go to a doctor, don't get checkups, you know. And because some minority communities were less likely to have signed up, the county worked with Black Healthcare Coalition to reach out to African Americans. They targeted the Hmong and Latino organizations with culturally appropriate materials, ran ads on Spanish language radio, made sure folks with disabilities had the information they needed to sign up. So the story to be told is one of just looking out for each other, just helping each other. This has been an incredible city and county-wide effort, not just in this competition, but for years. You've made Milwaukee a model for the nation. And you're proof that the Affordable Care Act works. Here's another piece of proof. Today I can announce that thanks to the law, 20 million more Americans now know the security of health insurance. 20 million. 20 million people. 20 million folks like Brent. That includes 6 million young people who were less likely to be insured before the Affordable Care Act. As many as 129 million Americans with pre-existing conditions can no longer be charged more or denied coverage just because they've been sick. Almost 140 million Americans who already have private insurance, so they didn't need to sign up for Obamacare, they're now guaranteed free preventive care as well, and checkups, mammograms. You're getting more for what you're paying for. So your insurance is better than it was. Even if you don't know it. Even if you didn't vote for me. Thanks, Obama. That's okay. You got an upgrade. And contrary to claims that this law would be a job killer, since I signed it, we've seen steady economic recovery. Our businesses have created jobs every single month, starting the month I signed the ACA into law. Every month. 71 straight months, 14 million new jobs, unemployment cut from 10% to 4.9%. Every month. And because this law fills the gaps in employer-based care, we know that when we change jobs, or we lose a job, or we go back to school, or start that new business, we can still get coverage. The point was not to replace the coverage that people had if they had a great job and they had great benefits. The idea was things happen. You lose a job, you're going to find another one, but in the meantime, you don't want to lose your house. Somebody in your family gets sick unexpectedly. You want to make sure that they're getting the best of care. That's what insurance is. And the Affordable Care Act is saving lives, not just for folks like Brett, but also because the law is encouraging hospitals to focus on quality of care. These are the kinds of things that, I don't know, they don't make headlines, but since we signed this law, we've seen a big drop in folks getting infections at hospital and other improvements in hospital care. That leads to some 87,000 fewer deaths and $20 billion in cost savings. And the Affordable Care Act is saving money. Most folks shopping in the new marketplace have discovered that they can buy a plan for less than $75 a month. Last year, 90,000 Wisconsin seniors on Medicare saved an average of more than $1,000 on their prescription drugs, thanks to the Affordable Care Act. And we've been moving Medicare toward a payment model that rewards quality of care over quantity of care. And that means we want doctors and hospitals to focus on giving folks the right tests and the right treatment, not just trying to sell more tests and sell more treatments. And that delivers better outcomes. We've just learned we've already hit our initial goal of getting 30% of Medicare payments into this new model that's better for patients. So, the Affordable Care Act, AKA Obamacare. It's saving lives and it's saving money. And we've done all this while creating millions of new jobs. We've cut our deficits by almost 75%. The act itself has cost less than the original projections. And meantime, healthcare price inflation is at its lowest level in 50 years. So even if you aren't covered by Obamacare, your premiums or your employer's premiums or your share of premiums have increased at a slower rate over these last 3 years than they had in the previous 50, which doesn't mean that you're not still seeing some increases, and you may not be happy about that, but understand that we've actually significantly reduced the pace at which it was going up. And look, you wouldn't know any of this if you listened to the politicians on the other side out there about this, who are obsessed with repealing this law. To them, the facts I just mentioned don't matter, because this is an issue of ideology. This has to do with we're just against it. Facts, evidence don't comport with their conviction that the ACA means an end to the American way. And repeal has been a rallying cry. And they say they want to replace, but they still haven't come up with a replacement. Partly because we designed this plan with the help of a bunch of Republican thinkers including the then governor of Massachusetts, this is the plan that they signed into law there. Congressional Republicans have tried and failed to repeal or undermine it about 60 times. They've told you what they'd replace it with about 0 times. They sure won't tell you what would happen if they actually did repeal it. If they got their way, 20 million people will have their insurance taken away from them. 20 million people. And by the way, Milwaukee, while you worked your tails off to cover enough folks to fill Lambeau Field, your governor still refuses to expand Medicaid in this state. And we could cover another 21,000 Wisconsinites with a stroke of his pen. He could join 31 other governors who are taking this option, which, by the way, actually would save money. He's denying Wisconsinites their ticket to health insurance, and it's political. Your senior senator won't tell you that if he gets his way and it repeals Obamacare, millions of working families would see their insurance premiums spike. The leader of the Republicans in Congress, who lives just south of here, won't tell you that if he got his way and repeals Obamacare, millions of women would go back to paying higher premiums just because they're women. Millions of seniors would see the price of their prescription drugs shoot up. Now they'll tell you, no, those are the good parts, we'd keep those. Well, if you add it all up, that's the Affordable Care Act. Why are you trying to repeal it? What is it exactly that you're trying to repeal? No, this is an important point. See, people don't know that, for example, kids being covered until they're 26, or making sure that you can't be discriminated against because of a pre-existing condition, or making sure that women aren't being discriminated against when it comes to health insurance, or free preventive care, or seniors getting reduced prices on the prescription drugs. They don't know necessarily that those things are part of this law. So when you ask Republicans about these things, they'll say, well, yeah, those are okay. We just want to repeal the other parts. As I said, when you add it up, that's the law. Why do you want to repeal it? We can't let that happen. It has been 6 years since I signed the Affordable Care Act into law. This is no longer just about a law. It's not about me. It's not about politics. This is about the reality that somebody like Brett goes through. I get letters every day, and people describe to me what it meant for them to have health care coverage. Now, if you're healthy at the moment, you may not think about it. But at some point, each of us goes through times where things don't work out that great. And you got to have a backup plan. Once you get out of Washington, most Americans support the reality that they don't want people not having coverage. The vast majority of folks like their coverage. The vast majority of folks are satisfied with their choices of doctors and hospitals. People like what we've done. The people who are actually using it, not just the people who are hearing about it on Fox News. I'm talking about people who are actually using it. For all the years of political fighting, all the repeal votes, all the predictions of apocalypse, the reality is that real people are finally getting insurance and having a bridge to stay insured as they go through various changes in their lives. That's taking place in places like this, in Milwaukee. Real communities looking out for each other. Now, we are going to keep working to make health care work even better. There are things that I would love to work with the Republicans on in the closing months of my presidency to fine-tune this thing and identify ways that we can improve quality even more and reduce prices even more. We could certainly get more folks covered who are currently being left out. We've got to keep working to get governors and state legislators to expand Medicaid and take care of their citizens. We've got to keep working to make prescription drugs more affordable. At Milwaukee, you have proved that what Americans care about most is not scoring political points, it's looking after each other. You've made a difference in people's lives. We're not going backwards. We're not going to go back to a time where people could be denied because of pre-existing conditions. That's not who we are. That's who we were. That's not who we are now. Americans know that. Earlier today, I had lunch at the engine company with Brent and a few others who had written me letters. Yeah, I get 10 letters every night. I read them. Keeps me connected to the people I'm supposed to be serving on a day-to-day basis. And one of the people who wrote to me was a woman named Karen George. A few years ago, while Karen was finishing her law degree, her husband was laid off for the second time in 6 years. First time, they lost their health insurance. They had no choice but to get on what's called COBRA. But as you know, that's a really expensive transition plan. They could barely afford it. This time, they had the Affordable Care Act on their side. By dinner time, Karen had signed up her family for an affordable plan in the new health insurance marketplace, so she knew they were safe, they were protected, they were covered. And Karen said in her letter, she said, when something like a layoff happens, you face a collection of moments of panic. To have one of those moments of panic go away was something. Right then, our health care was there when we needed it. Soon after that came another moment of panic. Just 1 week after graduating law school, Karen experienced chest pains, ended up in the ER with what turned out to be a heart problem. Without this plan, she wrote, I probably would have tried to take a nap and wait for the pain to go away. But instead, Karen got the care she needed. And Karen's kids have their mom. That's because of your efforts. Because of you, America's moving closer to the day where every American family has that same peace of mind. So we got more work to do, but you've shown us that when ordinary citizens come together as one family and one community and roll up our sleeves and look out for one another, that's when change happens. That's when we're at our best. That's how we're going to keep building a country that lives up to its highest ideals. I could not be prouder of it. Congratulations. God bless you, Milwaukee. God bless these United States of America. Good luck, Milwaukee Bucks. Love you guys.
You saw the announcement that the President will be going to Cuba with the First Lady on March 21st and 22nd. This is the first President to visit Cuba since Calvin Coolidge. As we've noted, Calvin Coolidge traveled there on a battleship, so the optic will be quite different from the get-go here. But I just wanted to step back and put this in a little bit of context. Clearly, this has been a sea change in terms of U.S. policy towards Cuba and U.S.-Cuban relations over the last year and a half since President Obama and President Castro announced on December 17, 2014, that we would have a process of normalizing relations. So to date, since we've made that announcement, there have been a number of steps forward. First of all, we intensively negotiated over several months the formal reestablishment of diplomatic relations, which culminated in Secretary Kerry traveling to Havana and raising the flag over our embassy. This embassy allows us to much more actively engage the Cuban people and the Cuban government to facilitate travel to Cuba from many different delegations from the United States and to pursue bilateral cooperation on a number of issues, and we've had an ongoing process of bilateral dialogues with the Cubans. What we've seen is enormous interest from the Cuban people in this opening and from people in the United States. And we've had businesses travel down to Cuba, state and local governments, academic exchanges, and a significant increase in American travel to Cuba. There's been a 54% increase in the number of Americans visiting Cuba since that announcement. I think we've also seen that the opening to Cuba holds out real promise to improve the lives of the Cuban people. And this is really at the core of our policy. Our judgment was that the embargo that was in place was doing nothing to achieve its stated aims of bringing about a political change in Cuba. In fact, the Castro government under Fidel and then Raul Castro had been in place for many decades. And it was also hurting the Cuban people because they were cut off from the United States. They were cut off in many ways from the world. And they were, again, not benefiting from U.S. policy. And we're seeking to reverse that dynamic. We've made a number of regulatory changes to increase travel and commerce to Cuba. Those, again, have had some benefits. The significant increases in remittances that go to Cuba, that directly benefits Cuban families. The increased travel benefits the nascent Cuban private sector, the cuentapropistas, shop owners, restaurant owners. U.S. companies like Airbnb have gotten into Cuba. This is their fastest growing market. That means travelers staying directly in Cuban homes, benefiting the Cuban people. And increasingly, as businesses have gone down and had discussions with the Cuban government, we're finding out ways that they can establish a presence. And just earlier this week, Kleber announced it's going to start to operate the first U.S.-owned factory in Cuba that will provide tractors for small farmers. These are just some indications of the fact that increased trade, commerce, and travel is going to benefit U.S. companies that are very interested in operating in Cuba, but ultimately it's going to directly benefit the Cuban people. Now, we have a potential to significantly increase those travel links with the announcement that was made earlier this week that we will be restoring direct flights between the United States and Cuba for the first time in several decades. That will allow up to 110 flights to Cuba every day. That's more people-to-people engagement and more opening between our two countries. We've raised a number of issues repeatedly with the Cuban government in terms of steps that we think that they could take to improve conditions on the island, both economically and human rights. We have seen some progress with respect to internet access in terms of additional wireless internet hotspots and efforts to link neighborhoods to broadband connections, but we'd like to see more in that space. And so we continue to indicate to the Cuban government that internet connectivity is essential to the ability of the Cuban people to connect with the global economy. It also, again, advances their ability to access information. We've also been supportive of the reforms that have created more space for a private sector within Cuba, self-employed Cubans, again, cuentapropistas. And this is an area where we believe we can continue to increase our economic engagement and see reforms within Cuba that can empower the Cuban people. At the same time, we, of course, have significant differences with Cuba on issues related to human rights, which we continue to raise directly with them. They took some steps in releasing political prisoners and hosting the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross last year, but we'd like, of course, to see more respect for the basic fundamental rights of the Cuban people, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. As we considered whether to go this year to Cuba, the president's judgment was that, number one, going to Cuba was an important step forward in signaling this new beginning between our two countries and peoples, and also importantly that going to Cuba could help enlarge this space that benefits the Cuban people and increases ties between our countries. And that in fact going earlier this year would allow us to try to get more done, both around his visit and in the days and months that follow. So what we'll be focusing on with respect to the visit is how can we take the changes we've made in our policies and regulations and try to connect them to changes and reforms that the Cubans are making so that there's more commercial activity, so that there's more of an opening for U.S. businesses, but importantly for Cubans to benefit from that activity and to be able to access more resources and, again, achieve a better life. How can we expand our people-to-people ties so that there's increased travel, but also increased cooperation in a number of areas? And we've had a good cooperation, for instance, discussions on issues related to medical cooperation, cancer vaccines. There are other areas where we can expand our people-to-people engagement. How are we supporting and encouraging efforts around, as I said, increased access to the internet and telecommunications in Cuba? How is Cuba, again, investing in this nascent private sector there? And of course, how are we engaging not just the Cuban government, but the Cuban people and Cuban civil society and speaking out for the human rights that we support around the world? And certainly on his trip, the president will have the opportunity to engage not just the Cuban government, but Cuban civil society, Cuban entrepreneurs, Cubans from different walks of life. So it's an important opportunity, this trip. It's historic in nature, but also we see it as a means of pushing forward this normalization process, trying to achieve a greater opening between the United States and Cuba commercially, but also supporting and advancing the values that we care about, all of which taken together we believe will be enormously beneficial to the Cuban people and, frankly, to U.S. Interests. Following the trip to Cuba, I just note the President will be traveling to Argentina. The Cuba opening also has to be seen as part of an effort by the United States to significantly increase our engagement in the hemisphere. This is a region that had long rejected our Cuba policy. Our Cuba policy had, in fact, isolated the United States more than it had isolated Cuba in the hemisphere. Argentina is a country that, until recently, had a president who had, I'll say, problematic relations with the United States. The new president there has indicated his interest in beginning and restoring and renewing U.S.-Argentina relations. That will be the business of that trip. So we'll be able to discuss how to increase our diplomatic, economic, and other forms of cooperation. I'll just close by saying that we've been engaging the Cuban government leading up to today, but we've also been engaging the Cuban-American community that follows these issues very closely, and will continue to do so. We've been engaging with our business community, with human rights advocates, and we will continue to do so between now and the trip. And we believe that at the end of the day, part of what makes the Cuba issue so unique is the interest and passion that Cuban Americans feel about it. We want to make sure that we're hearing their voices as we prepare for what will be a truly historic occasion. So I'll stop there and take questions. Yep, Jeff.
And will the president meet with dissidents when he's in Cuba, and how did you negotiate that with the Cuban government?
Yes, yeah, he'll be meeting with dissidents, with members of civil society, including those who certainly oppose the Cuban government's policies, just as when he went to Panama for the Summit of the Americas and met with Raul Castro, he also met with critics of the Cuban government in his civil society roundtable. I think the point that we make to the Cuban government is that we engage civil society in countries around the world, that this is part of how the president does business. When he travels in different regions, he meets with a broad range of actors, and Cuba is no different. So we may have a complex history, but the fact that we meet with and support people who are seeking to have their voices heard is part of what the United States does, and doesn't mean that we're seeking to overthrow the Cuban government. It means that we're seeking to support basic universal values that, again, we would care about in any country.
Do you expect him to see Fidel Castro while he's there, and do you expect this to be tied in any way to the Colombia peace talks?
So I wouldn't expect him to meet with Fidel Castro. Raul Castro is the president of Cuba. He'll certainly meet with President Castro. With respect to the Colombian peace process, we have had good cooperation from Cuba on that issue. The Cubans have hosted the talks between the Colombian government and the FARC. We have had a representative, Bernie Aronson, who's attended a number of those discussions. So we and the Cubans together have worked to support the Colombians as they are pursuing a peace agreement. So I think it'll certainly be a subject that we discuss with the Cuban government, that the president discusses with President Castro. At the end of the day, as the president told President Santos when he was here, we want the best deal for Colombia and the Colombian people, and that's what matters here. And we're willing to support that in any way we can. Michelle?
Back when the opening, the start of normalization was announced, you guys mentioned some things that you expected the Cuban government to do, including the release of those prisoners. But ahead of a presidential trip to Cuba, were there any conditions, or was there anything specific that you expected them to meet before this happened?
Yeah, so I think that the basic question that we've explored, including in discussions with the Cubans, is whether we could use the trip to demonstrate that normalization is making progress. And look, there are very different types of steps that each of us have to take. On the U.S. side, we've been methodically reviewing and in some cases changing our regulations to allow for more travel and commerce, and we will continue to do so in the weeks leading up to the trip. With respect to the Cubans, what we would like to see is that they are taking the types of steps that allow those regulatory changes to take hold that allow U.S. businesses to start to be able to operate in Cuba in ways that benefit the Cuban people, that allow for, again, greater opportunity and access to information for the Cuban people. Again, it's not as specific as the process we had with the Vatican in terms of the commitments that were announced on December 17th, but we do want there to be concrete progress that creates momentum for normalization, that demonstrates that normalization benefits the Cuban people and the American people, and that frankly can help make the changes that we're pursuing irreversible going forward. So there's a range of steps that the Cuban government could take to advance that process, and we'll be continuing to discuss that with them in the coming weeks. Now, of course, on human rights, we regularly raise a whole host of issues around certain cases of prisoners, certain patterns of detention, and certain limitations on rights, and that will be, of course, a part of the discussion as well. Yeah, Margaret.
And since you announced the sort of normalization process, there's been a dramatic spike in the number of Cubans fleeing for the U.S. Are those numbers sustainable, and is that wet foot, dry foot policy of the U.S. something that the president's going to address?
Yeah. So we've seen certainly an uptick in the number of Cubans, particularly Cubans traveling to Central America as part of an effort to make their way to the United States. I think that's tied to perhaps expectations around our policy changes, but also greater freedom of movement for Cubans to travel from Cuba, and frankly, in some cases, increased resources from some changes in our policies in other countries. We are not planning to institute change with respect to wet foot, dry foot, but we do regularly, again, look at our broader migration policies. We have a dialogue with the Cubans about those issues. We've worked very closely with our Central American partners as they've dealt with this influx of Cubans who are making their way to the United States. So we will be addressing the migration issue, but again, our focus is on how can conditions improve in Cuba so that over time there's more economic opportunity and less of a need, frankly, for Cubans to have to pursue opportunity elsewhere.
And will you be bringing a delegation of congressional members with you, particularly since you need congressional help to lift the embargo and those big things that are still in the way?
We'll certainly want to incorporate members of Congress into the president's trip. There are a number of members who've been, and both parties, I should add, this is an issue that does engender bipartisan support. We'll want to make sure that they're incorporated into what we're doing. Ron?
Are you satisfied with what the Cuban government has done on human rights? You sound disappointed.
Look, I don't think we will be satisfied. I don't think we've been satisfied to date, and frankly, I think that we're always going to have differences with this government because they have a different political system. At the same time, even with those kind of fundamental differences about how they organize their political system, we do think that there are steps that they can take that can improve conditions for the Cuban people and be a part of the evolution that is taking place on the island. Thus far, we've seen these incremental steps with respect to internet access and connectivity. We've seen some incremental increase in their engagement with the international community on these issues. I mentioned the head of the ICRC, but we'd like to see more.
Then why go now?
Because we believe that not going and isolating Cuba doesn't serve to advance those issues, that we will be in a better position to support human rights and to support a better life for the Cuban people by engaging them and raising these issues directly. And whether that's individual human rights cases that we're concerned about, whether that's the types of reforms that could broaden opportunity for the Cuban people, or whether that's just how do we directly engage Cuban civil society so that we are speaking out for the values that we support. Again, in our judgment, engagement is a far more effective means of addressing those issues than isolation.
And how concerned are you that all of this is still very reversible, is it not?
So we want to make this policy change irreversible. And that means that we want the links between Cubans and Americans and the links between our businesses and the engagement between our countries to gain such momentum that there's an inevitability to the opening that's taking place and to the increase in activity between our countries. To be very specific, we have an embassy opened in Cuba. That embassy allows us to travel more widely across the region, across the country, to engage the Cuban people. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to shut down an embassy that we have open. You have significant increases in Americans traveling to Cuba. That will only get higher as we institute direct flights and other measures. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to tell a lot of Americans that their government says that they can't be allowed to travel to Cuba. We have a lot of interest from the business community and the Chamber of Commerce in supporting this opening. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to tell American businesses that they have to shutter projects that they've initiated in Cuba. So our objective here is to do as much as we can with the time we have remaining to make this an irreversible policy. And frankly, I think the indications to date are that the American people support that.
Thanks, Ben. On Guantanamo Bay, how do you anticipate the conversation going about the property there? And secondarily, will there be a conversation about reparations? There are a number of Cuban Americans in particular in South Florida who lost potentially millions, if not billions, in personal property and assets. Will that be a part of the discussion as well?
So on Guantanamo Bay, I'm sure that will be part of the discussion. I know that because I've had that discussion many times with my Cuban counterparts. You know, they are insistent, obviously, that our presence there is not legitimate and that the facility be returned to them. But again, that is not on the table as a part of our discussions. We're focused on the range of issues that I discussed, but I'm sure that they will raise it. It continues to be an issue of concern to them. With respect to the claims issue, that will certainly be on the agenda as well. We have initiated, under the State Department's leadership, a dialogue with the Cubans on the issue of claims. There are many claimants in the United States. We've been engaging many of them to try to determine the best way forward to see that, again, their concerns are satisfied. So the Cubans also, frankly, have a substantial number of claims against us as well. So there's a formal dialogue on claims, and I think it'll be part of the agenda as well.
Just so I can circle back quickly on the prison, that is not going to be part of this. There's no way the government is going to give that back. There's not going to be a provision to give that back. That is not a part of this trip.
That's not a part of this trip, yeah.
Who determines which dissidents the president will meet with? Is that something that's negotiated? Do you already have, is that something that's already been discussed? And
we determine, who we, meet with in different countries. And we've certainly indicated to the Cubans that this is something the president will be doing on this trip as he does on other trips. Yeah.
Ben, was hoping you could flesh out why now. You've talked previously about using the prospect of the presidential trip as something of a carrot to get some of the concrete progress that you are hoping to see. Previously you've said that you would go when there was enough progress. This morning you wrote on Medium that you're going because there's insufficient progress. What's changed there?
Well, the fact is there's a little bit of both in the sense that what we want is to take all this opening, all this activity, and again, what we've seen over the last year, all this interest from businesses and state and local governments and the Cubans, and start to make it concrete, start to show outcomes and results. You're beginning to see that take hold. Again, the direct flights agreement that was reached. You have some businesses beginning to be able to operate in Cuba. But we've also been having discussions with the Cubans about all these issues. What more can we do so that becomes the beginning of something and is not a trickle, but leads to a much more significant flow of activity. And so we are confident that at this point, it is both the case that we have made progress in normalization. We've dealt with a number of the important issues that had to be addressed at the beginning of that process. But now we want to see more of that connectivity come online in terms of, again, commercial activity, in terms of many of the issues that we've been discussing with the Cuban government. And frankly, given the choice between going in December, when frankly it would just kind of be a vacation down to Cuba, or going now and trying to get some business done, we believe that the time is right to go and lean in and try to get as much done on this trip as we can, and try to create as much momentum as we can to carry that forward throughout the year.
You don't think you've lost leverage?
No, I don't think so, because again, first of all, this has been an ongoing process of discussions with the Cubans, and look, the president's also going to Cuba, and what he says and how that trip goes, as you all know from covering many trips, will depend on whether we are demonstrating progress. So I think the interest that both countries have in showing the progress on normalization and having this be a productive and successful visit, I think continues to create the conditions where there's an incentive to get things done. Yeah, Mark.
Ben, will President Obama get a chance to address the Cuban people?
Yeah, we have not developed a schedule, Mark, but I certainly think that he would want to look for some opportunity where he'll be able to speak to the Cuban people. So I don't want to suggest that we have a particular venue in mind, but again, I think he sees this as an opportunity where he's meeting the Cuban government, but he's also going to want to be engaging broadly with the Cuban people.
So you're looking to arrange something like that?
Something, yeah, but again, it's still preliminary. We haven't really begun to flesh out the elements of a schedule yet.
And would you expect a reciprocal invitation to be extended to President Castro?
Well, we'll take this one visit at a time. We were able to meet President Castro in New York. That was at UNGA, though. But our focus now is on this visit. Carol?
What specific policies are you hoping that the Cubans will announce at either during or after this visit? And do you expect that you guys will do an executive order to lift the travel ban to the extent that you can? And can I ask you one on Turkey? The Turks are accusing U.S.-backed Syrian Kurds of the attack yesterday and calling on you guys to sever ties with YPG. One, what is your response to that? And two, have you seen any evidence that their claims are true?
So we have not determined responsibility. We obviously condemn in the strongest possible terms the attacks that took place in Turkey. We as a government have not settled upon an assignment of responsibility, but we'll be engaging with the Turks on this. We've made clear to the Turks that in all of our engagements with the YPG and other Kurdish elements, that we make very clear to them the importance of our alliance with Turkey and the importance of them not engaging in efforts that would undermine what should be our focus, which is the shared threat of ISIL. So this is something, though, that we'll be talking directly to Turkey about. And we'll, of course, want to make sure that their security concerns as an ally are taken very seriously. And we'll want to make sure that the different actors that we're working with in Syria are focusing their attention where it should be, which is on the counter-ISIL effort. On your first Cuba questions, we have been steadily making regulatory changes since December 17th. We, at the end of January, announced our last tranche, but I would expect that that process will continue. So as we have additional regulatory changes to make, we will announce them. I don't want to preview what they are because that's an ongoing process that involves our efforts to ensure that not only reacting consistent with the laws that are on the books, even if we would lift the embargo if we could, but that we're also focused on the right issues and areas. Generally, what we've aimed to do is promote additional travel, commerce, and economic activity in Cuba that, again, we believe benefits the Cuban people. In terms of the steps the Cuban government can take, again, I don't want to be overly prescriptive from here. I would say that we talk to our business community. There are a number of things that Cuba could do that could make it easier for businesses to operate in Cuba and to operate in ways that benefit the Cuban people, to have a presence and to be able to engage Cuban workers. Again, there's actually a delegation here this week from Cuba, including the Minister of Trade, and we're discussing what are the practical steps that could be taken that, again, connect our regulatory changes with their economic reform efforts. There are also issues that we just regularly and consistently have raised. As I mentioned, internet access has been one of those. Our support for, again, their nascent private sector as a part of that economic reform agenda has been one. And then on human rights, I'm sure we'll have a number of specific issues that we'll be continuing to raise between now and the trip. We'll want to make clear that, you know, in any case, we'll be focused on those issues because the American people care about them, the president cares about them. Again, I think between now and the trip, and on the trip itself, we'll want to have steps taken by both the United States and Cuba that show how this is moving forward. And then there'll be areas of bilateral cooperation that we're pursuing with Cuba where we'll be exploring what can get done around a trip.
Can I ask just one more?
Yep.
Did you guys talk to folks on the Hill, particularly your critics of this policy in advance of this trip?
We've been doing outreach to the Hill. I myself spoke to a number of members. I don't like to read those out. I definitely spoke to people of different viewpoints, people who are critical of what we're doing and people who are very supportive. I will say that, you know, our judgment of what's taken place is you see increases in support for this policy on Capitol Hill, that if this is moving in a direction, it's moving in the direction of opening. And you see that with the number of people who are supporting lifting the travel ban in Congress. You see that in some initial efforts to lift the embargo. And you see it as something that crosses party lines. So, you know, you have Senator Leahy on the one hand, but also Senator Flake, who's very supportive of what we're doing. So part of what I think the opportunity is here is you have bipartisan support for this policy that has been growing, and we want to push that forward. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, I think critics have pointed to the spike in arrests of dissidents in Cuba as evidence that, you know, maybe they have Wi-Fi hotspots now, but kind of there's actually been a regression on human rights issues. So I'm wondering, do you guys see this as having been a net positive, or has this issue kind of been overshadowed some of the gains that have been made, especially economically? I wanted to ask really quickly if there had been progress made on returning some American fugitives that are now in Cuba, and then on Argentina, if the U.S. sees now that there's a new president, or a new first family for the first time in a long time, whether they can be an ally, and what kind of reception you expect the president to get, especially considering the one that President Bush received when he went down there.
So on human rights, first of all, we see everything that we're doing as being in the net positive for the lives and human rights of the Cuban people. I'd say a number of things. First of all, the economic issues ultimately are connected to the human rights issues because it gets at are the Cuban people going to benefit from having a better well-being? Are they going to be empowered by greater access to information in the outside world? But what we're also seeing is the expectations of the Cuban people have gone up for the future. And that's a good thing. We want the Cuban people to be hopeful for the future. We want them to see that there are possibilities for them to be continuing to pursue a better life. What we do see with the government is they have continued, in particular, a practice of these short-term detentions that are, again, deeply concerning. The number of kind of long-term political prisoners along the lines of a number of the people who were released around December 17th, those types of detentions have gone down over the years and months, but what we see is this practice of short-term detentions, harassment of people seeking to express basic rights, and that's an issue that we'll be raising directly with the Cuban government. And the fact of the matter is, the Cuban people see this as a hopeful time, as a moment of opportunity, and it's important that the Cuban government recognize that those aspirations of their people are going to ultimately redound to the benefit of Cuba, and it is not something to be put down. So it will be on the agenda, but as we look at this, it's important to remember we tried it one way for 50 years. We had an embargo, we had democracy funding, and you did not have a promotion of human rights on the island. We believe that this is a much better way to ultimately support the Cuban people and help them achieve a better life. I'll give you just one example. The U.S. government had an embargo that limited the Cuban people's ability to access all kinds of goods. At the same time that we were seeking to provide phones to some individual Cubans. Well, why not just try to allow all Cubans to have access to telecommunications? That, in our judgment, is a better way of advancing the things that we care about. With respect to Argentina, we definitely anticipate that they'll be a closer partner on a range of issues. And in fact, President Macri's been a strong voice for democracy and human rights in Latin America. He's signaled that he'd like to have a closer economic and diplomatic cooperation with the United States. So we believe this is really a new beginning and a new era in our relations with Argentina. And it mirrors the sentiment we see across the region, particularly since our Cuba opening, where there's much more receptivity to working with the United States. So I'd imagine the reception will be very positive, and it speaks to the goodwill throughout the hemisphere for President Obama. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. You talked about the embargo and trying to get it lifted. The trade minister earlier this week prescribed things that he thinks the White House can do without the lifting of the embargo. The allowing the dollar to be used in a third country and permitting U.S. import of rum and cigars, of course. That might be something
I don't know if that's of interest to anybody here, but
have those things been considered? Is it too soon? When would be appropriate to consider those, especially if you continue to have the intransigence that you see in Congress to lift the embargo?
Yeah, we've been considering those issues, and essentially what look, our judgment is that the embargo should be lifted. Short of that, we want to look at what are the areas where we can open up space that can promote the greatest travel and commercial activity that ultimately, again, benefits the Cuban people. So we are looking at those issues, and as I said to Carol, I'd expect that just as we've kind of on a regular basis been rolling out these different regulatory changes, that we'll be able to continue to do that in the coming weeks. We think that's in our own interest. We think that helps advance the interests of Americans who want to travel to Cuba to engage the Cuban people, or American businesses that want to engage in Cuba, but also, frankly, in helping ordinary Cubans. So we'll be looking at that. Yeah.
What would be the technical process of doing that?
So it's a very technical process, and essentially what it involves is different agencies of the U.S. government, in particular as it relates to our sanctions policy, Treasury, where we very much would urge the confirmation of Adam Zubin, because he oversees this office and it's very important work. Treasury reviewing our regulations and deciding what type of licenses to issue, what type of policy changes that can be made, and of course everything that we do has to be reviewed by Office of Legal Counsel to ensure that it's consistent with existing law. Juliet.
One specific question and one broader one. Specifically, the First Lady doesn't go on that many foreign trips. Could you talk about what her participation means and whether the Obama's daughters are going, because it does say the first family will meet President Macri? And more broadly, could you talk about how the administration's work with Burma on similar issues regarding democratization has helped inform what's happening with Cuba, where you see parallels and where you see differences?
So the First Lady will be coming. I don't, I don't think we, have an answer with respect to the children at this point. But the First Lady will definitely be accompanying the President. I think she's taken a greater interest in issues related to girls' education internationally as we've moved into the second term, and again that's beyond the United States. So that's been the substantive focus that she's had. But I also think that she looks for the appropriate opportunities that have in part to do with their schedules aligning, also in part having to do with focusing on regions where I think she can help us advance our efforts. And if you look at this type of trip, what the First Lady is frankly singularly good at is she's an enormously popular figure in different countries around the world, generates a lot of goodwill, and is a very able messenger for America and its values. And so going to a place like Cuba for the first time, in this presidency in the first time in many years, and having this kind of historic opening to the Cuban people. I think it's very important that she's there and that her voice is a part of the conversation, and that this region more generally of the Americas is one that she's interested in engaging. So we very much welcome her participation. With respect to Burma, I do think there are some parallels and obviously a lot of differences. The core parallel is that we believe that the policy of not engaging Burma and Cuba was not working in either case. When we came into office in Burma, you'd had a military junta that had ruled with an iron fist for many years. You had Aung San Suu Kyi and many other people in prison. You had an economy that was closed off from the rest of the world. And we felt that simply using isolation and sanctions wasn't working to resolve that situation. And so the president engaged. And we engaged broadly in Burma. So we engaged the government, but we also engaged civil society. We also engaged entrepreneurs. We also sought to promote economic ties to show the benefit that could come from more engagement with the international community. And we've seen that have an enormous effect in just a small number of years in Burma in opening up space there, in restoring their connections to the international community, and ultimately in a very successful election that took place late last year. And I note, the president traveled to Burma twice. Even when those questions were still very much in play. Our judgment is you don't wait until the story's over to show up and find out what happened. That just puts us on the sidelines. And that by going to a place like Burma, he was able to advance the things that we care about. He was able to raise the hopes of the people there, and he was able to restore a relationship with a country that had been deeply estranged from the United States. Cuba is very different in that, in terms of size, in terms of the issues in play, in terms of politics. But I think the common thread is that we believe we can accomplish more through engagement. We believe that engagement should be with the government, but also with the people of the country. And we believe that greater connectivity to the United States and the international community, diplomatically, economically, ultimately is going to be to the benefit of the Cuban people.
Just one follow-up. Would you say that it's harder, however, to do this in Cuba because you don't have this kind of mobilized opposition the way you had in Burma? Is that one of the things that makes potentially democratization a little more challenging in this instance?
Well, you had Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, and so there was, an opposition figure of enormous renown, whereas in terms of the politics in Cuba, you have a one-party system, and then you have elements of opposition, but it's not analogous to the long-standing prominence of the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, including their running and winning an election in the late 80s. So the political circumstances are certainly different. Julie?
Thanks. As you've outlined, the United States government has done a lot to sort of relax our restrictions and facilitate some more travel and commerce with Cuba. They haven't done nearly as much on their end, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, imports were down from the U.S. last year substantially, and as you mentioned, they haven't done anywhere near what we'd like to see them do on human rights. So can you just sort of address this criticism that you're getting from some of the opponents of this policy, that this trip really rewards a regime that in many ways is still, very much against American values and has not done what we wanted, or what the president wanted to see happen when he first announced this a year and a half ago?
Well, look, first of all, we do have enormous restrictions still in place. We have an embargo in place. The Cubans themselves, I think, certainly, continue to point to all of those restrictions as a constraint. The fact of the matter is, we do believe that they could do some things, practical things, that could make it easier for businesses to operate in Cuba, to establish a presence in Cuba, to engage Cuban workers directly, to interact with their private sector. So there's a range of issues that we've been discussing with them, and we've been able to find, in some cases, direct solutions. Airbnb can get in because they're directly engaging the Cuban people and that private sector. Kleber was able to find a means of establishing a factory that will benefit small farmers through the production of tractors. But we want to do much more of that. We want to see the Cubans take steps that allow for an opening for U.S. businesses, because ultimately we believe if our businesses are operating there and there's travel there, that that's going to be to the benefit of people. So again, a degree of progress, some steps by the Cuban government on whether it's internet access or specific arrangements with U.S. companies, but not enough. And that leads to the core point, which is we believe the best way to try to push this forward is for the president to go. That essentially there's been a whole range of activity. Part of what businesses have been able to do is, and we've been able to do, is kind of look under the hood of the Cuban regulations and the Cuban legal framework over the course of the last year. This is not a country that was, in many ways, designed or prepared to immediately engage the U.S. private sector. But I think we now have that understanding. So I think that there is an opening for us to try to push a much greater degree of activity through. And again, the basic point we would make to critics is, the way to carry this policy forward is to keep leaning forward and to keep engaging more and to keep pressing for greater activity and to keep pressing for the Cubans to take steps in line with our steps that open up this space between our countries. And pulling back would only make it harder to achieve those things, but a presidential visit is a forcing mechanism, and I think it has a potential benefit of making our government and the Cuban government do as much as we can to make normalization move forward.
Have you made it clear to them that you want to see more changes on their end in exchange for this trip, as in the run-up to or during the visit between the two presidents?
Again, it's not, it's not a quid pro quo, but I think we would like the trip to show the concrete progress in normalization, and so it's an opportunity to demonstrate results. And frankly, insofar as the Cuban government wants to meet the expectations of their own people, which have been raised by this opening of the United States, and help improve the livelihoods of the Cuban people, that engagement will serve those objectives. We feel very strongly that engagement is a far preferable way of pursuing the things that America cares about than isolation.
Well, you take two in the back and then we'll let
Yeah.
you go. Olivia, you want to go next?
Sure, I got a couple for you, Ben. One, building on Carol's question, I think you alluded to this too. Any sign that Cuba is going to let American businesses directly hire from the Cuban labor pool?
So that's an issue that's an example of an issue that we have continually raised with them, and we would like there to be increasing opportunities for American businesses to hire Cubans and foreign businesses to hire Cubans. And again, sometimes that's very easy. If it's Airbnb contracting with a Cuban home, that's one thing. But if it's a U.S. company hiring workers, those are the types of issues that we're discussing with them.
Any progress towards nominating an ambassador to Cuba?
That's something that we're still working through. Again, as some of you have heard me say, one of the reasons why we've been comfortable where we are is because we have an excellent chief of mission down there, and Jeff De Laurentiis, who's of ambassador rank, worked closely with Susan Rice when she was at the UN, very well thought of in Cuba and in the United States. So we're comfortable with Jeff, but we're going to certainly be addressing the question of ambassador in the coming months.
And finally, when U.S.-Vietnam relations were normalized not quite 20 years ago, we heard a lot about how the previous approach had failed and how this was going to lead to greater openness. You read the State Department report on human rights now for Vietnam, and it's just ghastly. It's egregious political abuses. What do you say to critics who say that by broadening the American engagement with Cuba, you are, in effect, putting American businesses in the service of an authoritarian regime that's going to use them for patronage for jobs and is going to prop itself up that way?
So a few things. One, Vietnam is not 90 miles from Florida. Two, I think that what American businesses can bring is greater opportunity for Cubans, greater connectivity to the United States and to the Cuban American community, Yes, I mean, if the Cuban economy improves, there'll be more resources for the government, but there'll be far more resources for the Cuban people. And if you look at the direction of the Cuban economy, a lot of the activity, a lot of the growth is in the Cuenta Propista sector and is in sectors that are engaging the rest of the world. So we believe that American business is a net positive for the Cuban people, and that over time is going to bring about real benefits and improvements in their lives. And then there are certain sectors, obviously, where we can make a critical difference if you look at something like telecommunications. But the last thing I'd say is part of what's different is we have a Cuban American community that is deeply invested in the future of Cuba, that cares deeply about the well-being and the rights of the Cuban people. And I think what we've heard from many of them is they see that Cuba is changing. There is an evolution taking place in Cuba, and we can either be a part of that or not. And if we keep ourselves out of it, and the Europeans and others are there helping to shape this change that's taking place, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why I think you have people like Carlos Gutierrez and other Cuban Americans who've come to this recognition that this is the moment for us to engage. Because again, this is a government that was very comfortable for over 5 decades with the embargo in place and with the United States as essentially the source of legitimacy that they drew upon because of what we were trying to do to Cuba. We have seen Raul Castro begin to initiate a set of reforms in Cuba. They obviously aren't at the pace and scale that the United States would suggest with their economy, and it obviously doesn't get at the core political issues, but there's an evolution taking place. And we want to be a part of that evolution. We don't want to remove ourselves from it.
Yes, ma'am, I'll give you the last one in the back.
Thank you so much. The embargo is a big obstacle. The Cubans want it lifted because it's a big hurdle to normalizing relations. Can you talk about how it's playing on the campaign trail? Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz already said that these are, justifiable concessions. So can you talk about whether or not the president is concerned, as others have said here today, that should a Republican win the White House, all of this is going to be reverted? And then for Argentina, can you elaborate more on the timing of the trip? It's been 2 decades, as you said before. What specific message is the president bringing to President Macri?
Well, I think the timing is we wanted to go early in this administration, given that President Macri had expressed his interest in renewing our relationship. So we want to sit down with him early in his term to chart the way forward, but also demonstrate that a cornerstone of the president's legacy is his approach to Latin America, and that involves the Cuba opening, that involves the Colombia peace process, but it also involves making sure that we're leaving strong relations with important countries like Argentina. And I think it's fitting to go on the back end of the Cuba trip for that reason as well. With respect to your first question, first of all, again, the long-standing approach that those senators have supported has failed to produce any results. The Cuban government is still in place. It's not as if one more year of the embargo is going to bring transformational change. This was a policy that we pursued for decades. We have an evidentiary basis to make an assessment that it's not working. But even beyond that, it wasn't helping the Cuban people. The Cuban people were suffering because of the embargo and because of these restrictive policies. And the fact of the matter is, the thing that we should all agree on, and I think we do all agree on, is we want a better life for the Cuban people. The Cuban people support these changes. Every indication is that they overwhelmingly support engagement with the United States. So why would we, in service of our objective of helping the Cuban people, ignore their voices and tell them that they're going to have to continue to live under the embargo and tell them that they're going to have to live cut off from the rest of the world? Let's listen to the Cuban people. They are invested in this. They see this as potentially leading to a better future. And moreover, I don't think that it's the right way to think about the changes we've made as not in our own interest. It's not a concession to have an embassy. That makes no sense. An embassy allows us to better represent our interests, to better engage civil society, to better facilitate American commerce, to better speak up for the things we care about. It's not a concession to allow Americans to travel to Cuba. Americans would very much like to travel to Cuba. So explaining to them that it's some concession to allow them to do something they want doesn't make a lot of sense either. And it's not a concession to allow American businesses to pursue opportunities that they're seeking in Cuba. That's in our own interest. That's the opposite of what a concession is. So I think, again, to just conclude on your question, the reason we think that this will be irreversible is because the logic of it is so clear. What we were doing was not working. This has a better chance of having a successful outcome for our interests. If people are traveling there, they're not going to want to be told that they can't travel there anymore. If businesses are starting to operate there, they're not going to want to be told to shut down. If we have an embassy there, it doesn't make much sense to shut it down. If we have new opportunities in the Americas because we've gotten rid of this anchor on our standing in the region, it doesn't make much sense to immediately anger and alienate the Western Hemisphere by reversing this policy. And that's why we believe you see bipartisan members of Congress, but also a diverse group of stakeholders from the Chamber of Commerce to many, many, many people in the Cuban American community to the faith communities like the Catholic Church, all supporting this change in policy.
Is the President confident that either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton will continue his legacy in this foreign policy arena?
Well, without commenting on specific candidates, I mean, I think that positions that they've taken clearly indicate support for our policy, and certainly we believe that they understand that the old approach didn't work and that this is a better way of pursuing things.